Parents took my sister on a luxury vacation instead of me. Later, she ruined their lives. Hello, read it. People like to say that all parents love their children equally, that family will always be fair, that no matter what, each child is cherished the same way. But that's a lie. Some parents have favorites, and some children grow up knowing, without a doubt, that they will always come second. I learned this lesson early. My name is Noah, and I'm 21 years old. My sister, Rachel, is 24. For as long as I can remember, Rachel has been my parents' pride and joy, the daughter they always wanted, the one they showered with attention, praise, and gifts. And me? I was the extra, the afterthought, the one who was expected to stay quiet, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I was given, to never ask for more than I was offered. It wasn't just about Rachel being the older child. It wasn't about me being neglected in any extreme way. It was the small things, the everyday moments that built up over the years, the patterns that became impossible to ignore. Rachel got the bigger bedroom, even though she moved out for college and I still lived at home. Rachel got a brand new car for her 18th birthday, while I was told to be happy with a used one that barely ran. Rachel was allowed to stay out late, have parties, break curfews, because she was responsible, because she deserved trust. But when I tried to do the same, I was too young, too reckless, too immature. Every holiday, every special occasion, somehow became about her. On Christmas, she would get expensive jewelry, designer bags, and plane tickets while I got a couple of things my parents picked up at the last minute. On birthdays, she was taken out to fancy restaurants, showered with expensive gifts, given everything she asked for, while I was lucky to get a cake from the grocery store. If I ever brought it up, I was told I was being ungrateful. If I ever complained, I was guilt-tripped into silence, because Rachel had a hard year, Rachel needs this more, Rachel deserves it. I tried to convince myself it didn't bother me, that I didn't care, that if I just kept my head down, stayed quiet, and did what was expected, maybe one day my parents would start treating me like I mattered too. But deep down, I knew that day would never come. And nothing proved it more than what happened last summer. My parents have been talking about this vacation for years. A dream trip, the kind they always fantasized about, the kind they had saved up for. A 2-week cruise, luxury hotels, a full itinerary of excursions in the Caribbean. It was something special, something that felt once in a lifetime. And for the first time, I let myself believe that I would actually be part of it. I should have known better. 2 weeks before they were set to leave, my parents sat me down and told me, in the most casual way possible, that I wouldn't be going. They had already made their decision, already booked everything, already packed their bags. And Rachel? Rachel was going instead. They didn't even try to sugarcoat it. They didn't even act like they had struggled with the decision. Instead, they fed me the same bullshit excuses I had heard my entire life. Rachel had been stressed. Rachel deserved this. Rachel needed the break more than I did. I didn't. I could stay home. I could watch the house. I could be understanding, because that's what they had always expected from me. I should have been used to it. I should have seen it coming. But this time was different. This wasn't just another birthday overshadowed by Rachel. Another holiday where she got everything and I got nothing. This was my own parents choosing her over me in a way that felt impossible to ignore. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't try to change their minds. I just nodded, stood up, and left the room. And they didn't even seem to care. So they left. They packed their bags, smiled for vacation photos, and set off on their dream trip. And I stayed home, alone in the house, thinking about how no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be good enough for them. But something strange happened while they were gone. At first, it was peaceful. I didn't have to listen to my parents talking about Rachel all day. I didn't have to deal with her constant bragging, her entitled attitude, the way she always acted like she was better than me. I worked, I hung out with my friends, I had the house to myself. And for once, it felt like I was free. I didn't have to pretend to be okay with being second place. I didn't have to pretend that I wasn't angry. And yet, that anger didn't fade. It grew. I stopped answering my parents' calls. When they texted me pictures from the trip, I ignored them. When they sent me updates, I left them on read. I knew they probably thought I was sulking, that I was being dramatic, that I would eventually get over it like I always did. But this time, I wasn't going to. Then one night, I got a text from a family friend, someone who wasn't even on the trip, asking me if everything was okay. When I asked what they meant, they just said my parents had posted something online that was worrying, that things weren't going as planned, that something had happened. That was when I checked their social media. At first, I thought they had just posted more pictures, smiling on a beach, sitting by a pool, pretending they were living the perfect vacation. But I was wrong. The first thing I saw was a long, frantic post from my mom, talking about how their trip had been completely ruined. And somehow, Rachel was at the center of it. I had no idea what had happened yet. I had no idea what Rachel had done. But for the first time in my life, my parents sounded furious with her. And that was the moment I realized something had changed. For years, I had watched them defend her, excuse her, put her first no matter what she did. But now, they were angry. Now they were embarrassed. Now they were turning on her. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had happened on that trip. And whatever it was finally making my parents see Rachel for who she really was. When I first saw my mom's frantic post online, I didn't know what to think. My parents had spent my entire life worshiping Rachel, defending her no matter what she did, acting like she was perfect even when it was obvious she wasn't. But now they were angry. Now they were publicly complaining about her. That had never happened before. And that was the moment I knew something had gone wrong. I sat there, rereading the post over and over, trying to piece together what had happened. It was vague, clearly written in a rush, and filled with the kind of dramatic, panicked wording that made it obvious my parents were humiliated. There were mentions of huge arguments, unexpected expenses, and a ruined vacation. My mom kept saying how this wasn't what we planned, and how she and my dad had been completely blindsided. But the part that stuck out the most? The one sentence that made me sit up and pay attention? We thought Rachel would be more mature than this. I almost laughed when I read that. More mature? Rachel had never been mature. She had never been responsible, never been the type of person who thought about anyone but herself. But my parents had always refused to see it. They had always made excuses for her, always found a way to shift the blame, always told themselves that Rachel was never the problem. But now, something had happened that they couldn't ignore. I didn't text them. I didn't ask what was going on. If they wanted me to know, they could tell me themselves. Instead, I went about my day, waiting, watching, knowing that eventually more information would come out. And I didn't have to wait long. That night, I got a text from my cousin, Emily. She was the only family member who had ever acknowledged how unfairly my parents treated me. She had always been on my side, always noticed how Rachel was put on a pedestal while I was ignored. And now she had news. Rachel had gotten into trouble. Big trouble. Emily had heard from another relative that things had gone downhill fast on the trip. Rachel had been drinking too much, spending ridiculous amounts of money, arguing constantly, and causing scenes everywhere they went. It started small, complaining about the room, demanding special treatment from hotel staff, throwing tantrums when things didn't go her way. But it had escalated quickly. By the third day of the trip, she had maxed out her credit card on shopping and demanded that my parents cover her expenses. And when they refused, when, for the first time, they actually told her no, she lost it. Emily told me that my parents had gotten into a massive fight with Rachel in the middle of a restaurant. Rachel had started yelling, crying, causing such a scene that other guests had started recording her meltdown on their phones. Security had been called, and my parents had been forced to leave the restaurant in shame. That was bad enough, but it didn't stop there. Rachel had gone out drinking that night, furious at my parents for ruining her fun. She had disappeared for hours, ignoring their calls, acting like a spoiled teenager instead of a 24-year-old adult. When she finally came back, she was wasted. She had spent hundreds of dollars on alcohol and expensive clubs, run up a huge bill, and was too drunk to even stand. My parents had to drag her back to the hotel, humiliated, furious, starting to realize, maybe for the first time, who Rachel really was. I thought that was the worst of it. It wasn't, because Rachel wasn't just being reckless. She was being dangerous. The next morning, she stole my dad's wallet. Emily told me that Rachel had woken up hungover and pissed off, still angry that my parents weren't treating her right. And instead of apologizing, instead of taking responsibility for the chaos she had caused, she made it worse. She waited until my dad was in the shower, then went through his things, took his credit card, and left the hotel. She didn't even try to be sneaky about it. She just walked out, leaving my parents in a panic when they realized their money was gone. By the time they figured out what had happened, Rachel had already racked up thousands of dollars in charges. And then, the real disaster happened. Rachel had been stupid. She wasn't just spending money recklessly. She was breaking the law. Some of the charges on my dad's card were flagged as suspicious transactions. And when the hotel noticed the unauthorized spending, they contacted authorities. And that's when Rachel got arrested. The moment Emily told me, I actually had to sit down. My golden child sister, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, the one who had always been untouchable, was sitting in a foreign jail. I didn't even know what to feel. For years, I had watched her get away with everything. I had watched my parents bend over backwards to protect her, to shield her from consequences, to act like she was perfect even when she wasn't. But now they couldn't protect her. Now, they were forced to deal with the mess they had created. Rachel had been so used to getting everything she wanted, so used to manipulating my parents, that she had never learned how to handle being told no. And now, for the first time in her life, she was paying the price for her own actions. And my parents? They were finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't text them. I didn't call. I just waited, because sooner or later, they were going to come back. And when they did, I wanted to see exactly how they would explain this. I waited. I knew that eventually, my parents would have to crawl back home, exhausted, humiliated, and forced to face the mess they had spent years ignoring. But for now, all I had to do was sit back and watch it all unfold. Rachel had always been the untouchable one, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I had spent my whole life watching my parents make excuses for her, justify her selfishness, and protect her from every consequence. But now, Rachel was sitting in a jail cell, and for the first time ever, they couldn't save her. Emily kept me updated, feeding me details as she got them. My parents were frantic, scrambling to fix things, desperate to keep the family image intact. But there was no easy way out this time. Rachel wasn't just drunk and disorderly. She had stolen a credit card. She had committed fraud, and in a foreign country, that wasn't something they could just talk their way out of. It had taken hours for my parents to even find out where she had been taken. When they did, they rushed to the station, demanding to speak to someone in charge. But the local authorities weren't impressed with their panic or their privilege. My mom had burst into tears. My dad had tried to negotiate, but all they got was a cold explanation of the charges against Rachel. She had spent stolen money. She had signed receipts in my dad's name. She had thrown a fit when hotel staff refused to let her book more services on a flag card. The police had been called after she refused to leave, and when she shoved one of the officers, she had sealed her fate. Rachel wasn't just facing theft charges. She had assaulted an officer. And now, my parents were powerless. They had to hire a lawyer, pay thousands of dollars in legal fees, and beg for leniency. But the worst part was that they had to wait. Because even with all their money, even with all their desperate pleading, Rachel wasn't being released immediately. She had to stay in jail overnight. For the first time in her life, Rachel was alone. No parent swooping in to fix things. No special treatment. No one telling her she was the victim. And that was when it really hit me. Rachel had never learned how to handle consequences. She had spent years getting away with everything, manipulating our parents, throwing tantrums, and being treated like a princess. But the real world didn't care. And now, she was terrified. Emily sent me a voice message later that night, her tone half amused, half exhausted. She had spoken to my mom, who was beside herself, going on and on about how she had never expected this from Rachel, how she had no idea what went wrong, how this was so unlike her. It was almost laughable. Rachel had always been selfish. She had always been reckless. She had always believed that she was above the rules. The only difference now was that, for once, someone actually held her accountable. Rachel spent the night in a holding cell. No expensive hotel bed, no luxury accommodations, no one catering to her every whim. The moment she was finally released, she looked like she had been through hell. My parents had spent the night panicking, calling lawyers, draining their bank accounts to fix what Rachel had done. But no amount of money could erase what had happened. They had spent the entire vacation bragging about Rachel, posting pictures of their dream trip, showing off how perfect their lives were. And now, everyone they knew had seen the truth. Their golden child had been arrested, their perfect vacation had turned into a nightmare, and no amount of damage control could change the fact that Rachel had humiliated them in front of everyone. Rachel wasn't just a disappointment. She was a liability. They came home in silence. The moment the front door opened, I could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. My mom's eyes were red, her face pale. My dad looked like he had aged 10 years, and Rachel wouldn't even look at me. She walked past me, head down, shoulders slumped, like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The arrogance, the entitlement, the smug attitude that had always been there, it was gone. She didn't say anything. She just went straight to her room and shut the door. My parents weren't much better. They sat in the living room, silent, defeated, looking at each other like they still hadn't processed what had happened. For the first time in my life, they didn't seem to know what to say. There were no excuses, no lectures, no attempts to blame anyone else. There was just shame. Rachel had a court date. My parents had to deal with lawyers, paperwork, fines, and the overwhelming reality that their perfect daughter wasn't perfect at all. She had nearly ruined them financially, embarrassed them beyond belief, and for the first time, they couldn't just sweep it under the rug. The entire family knew. Their friends knew. The neighbors knew. The people they had always tried so hard to impress had seen them at their absolute lowest. I watched as they tried to pretend that things were normal. My mom went into the kitchen, aimlessly moving things around, pretending like she had something to do. My dad sat on the couch, staring at the TV, but not actually watching it. It was like they thought if they just kept moving, if they just ignored it long enough, the weight of what had happened would eventually disappear. But it wouldn't. This wasn't something they could fix with money. This wasn't a problem that would just go away. Rachel had destroyed everything, and now they finally had to deal with it. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. I just watched as they sat in their own misery, realizing that for the first time, they had no one to blame but themselves. They had created this. They had enabled Rachel's behavior for years, allowed her to believe she was untouchable, let her think she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. And now, when it had finally caught up to her, when the real world had finally smacked her in the face, they were the ones left picking up the pieces. There was no fixing this. And deep down, I think they finally understood that. Rachel had been the center of my parents' universe for as long as I could remember, the one they bent over backward to accommodate, the one they would defend no matter what she did. But now, for the first time, I was watching them struggle to come to terms with something they could no longer ignore. Their golden child had ruined everything. She had turned their dream vacation into a humiliating disaster, drained them financially, and left them scrambling to fix the damage. But this time, there was no easy way out. The days following their return were tense and suffocating. Rachel barely left her room, refusing to face the consequences of what she had done. My parents, once full of excuses for her, now sat in silence, shell-shocked and exhausted. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting for Rachel to show remorse, waiting for an easy solution to present itself, waiting for reality to go back to the way it had always been. But it wouldn't. Things had changed. Rachel had a court date looming over her, and for the first time in her life, my parents couldn't make it disappear. They had tried. They had pleaded with the authorities, hired expensive lawyers, and thrown money at the problem, but none of it was enough. The case wasn't just about the money she had stolen. It was about her assaulting an officer and her repeated reckless behavior. That wasn't something they could brush under the rug. They had managed to get her out on bail, but the stain of what had happened wouldn't just fade. The legal fees alone had already put a massive dent in their finances, and now they were looking at fines, penalties, and possible probation for Rachel. Rachel wasn't handling it well. The moment she had stepped back into the house, she had retreated into herself, locking herself in her room for days, refusing to talk to anyone. She wasn't used to this, being truly, undeniably wrong. She had never experienced the weight of her own mistakes before, never had to sit in the consequences of her own actions without someone swooping in to fix everything. She must have been waiting for my parents to find a way to make it all go away, but when that didn't happen, when the silence stretched on and she realized that she was actually on her own this time, something in her started to crack. It wasn't long before the guilt turned into rage. One morning, after days of avoiding everyone, Rachel stormed into the kitchen where my parents were sitting, looking worse than I had ever seen her. She was angry, but beneath that, there was something else: fear, desperation, the realization that things weren't going to go back to normal. She lashed out at them, demanding to know why they weren't doing more to help her, why they were letting this happen, why they weren't being parents and fixing this. But for the first time in her life, my parents didn't have an answer. I had never seen them like this before. They just sat there, exhausted, empty, like they had nothing left to give. My mom, who had always jumped to Rachel's defense in the past, who had always scolded anyone who dared to say Rachel was wrong, just shook her head. My dad, who had always quietly enabled Rachel's behavior, who had always found a way to soften her mistakes, didn't even look at her. They had been humiliated, drained, financially wrecked, and now, for the first time, they were realizing that Rachel wasn't just a spoiled child. She was a problem they had created. Rachel didn't take it well. She screamed, she cried, she blamed everyone but herself. She accused my parents of abandoning her, of letting her suffer, of choosing money over family. She acted like she was the victim, like what had happened wasn't her fault but something that had been done to her. And when my parents didn't react, when they didn't rush to her side and tell her everything was okay, when they just sat there and let her unravel, it became clear that something had finally snapped between them. They weren't protecting her anymore. They weren't making excuses. They weren't saving her. And for Rachel, that was the worst punishment of all. I watched the fallout from a distance, barely speaking to any of them. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because for once, I didn't need to. My parents had spent years ignoring the truth, years treating me like I was invisible, years making sure Rachel got everything while I got nothing. And now, all on their own, they were seeing exactly who she was. They didn't need me to say, "I told you so." They were living it. The legal battle dragged on for weeks. My parents had to negotiate a plea deal for Rachel, which meant probation, community service, and a massive fine that they had to pay. The debt from the vacation, the lawyer fees, and now the penalties were crushing them. They had spent their entire lives giving Rachel everything, bending over backward to make her happy, and now she had ruined them financially. Rachel tried to recover, tried to act like she was still above everything, but the damage had already been done. The family saw her differently. Friends distanced themselves. People who had once admired her, who had been fooled by the illusion of her perfect life, now whispered about the scandal, the arrest, the disgrace. The image she had built for herself had been shattered. And my parents? They had to live in the wreckage. There was no fixing this. They knew it, and I knew it. The years of favoritism, the years of enabling Rachel, the years of treating me like I was disposable while she was the only one who mattered, it had all led to this moment. And for the first time, they couldn't hide from it. My dad stopped talking as much. My mom barely smiled. Rachel spent most of her time locked in her room, sulking, bitter that her fantasy world had collapsed around her. No one was happy. No one won. But I didn't feel bad for them. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was the one who had lost, because I had spent years being treated like I didn't matter. And now, after everything, they finally had to face what they had done. They had chosen Rachel over me, and Rachel had destroyed them. The house felt different after the fallout. The tension wasn't just lingering, it was suffocating. My parents barely spoke, moving through the house like ghosts, weighed down by the crushing realization that they had destroyed their own family. Rachel, the golden child they had worshipped for years, was no longer the center of their world. She had burned that pedestal to the ground, and now, with nothing left to stand on, she was sinking. At first, she tried to pretend like nothing had changed. She acted like the arrest, the probation, the fines were just a temporary inconvenience, something she could brush off. She went out with friends, spent hours locked in her room, scrolling through social media, trying to convince herself that she was still important, still admired, still the person she had always been. But the world had moved on. Her friends didn't treat her the same anymore. People whispered about her behind her back. She wasn't the flawless, untouchable favorite anymore. She was a joke, and it was eating her alive. She started lashing out more, slamming doors, picking fights over nothing, throwing tantrums like she was still a child who could scream until she got what she wanted. But no one was listening. My parents had nothing left to give her. They were financially wrecked, emotionally drained, and for the first time in their lives, they had stopped defending her. She wasn't special anymore. She was a burden. The real breaking point came one evening when I came home from work and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills with a blank expression. My dad sat across from her, rubbing his temples, looking older, smaller, like the weight of the world had finally crushed him. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The reality was staring them in the face. They had spent everything on Rachel, her legal fees, her fines, the debts from the trip, and now they were drowning. And Rachel? She didn't care. She kept spending money. She still expected them to fix everything. She kept treating them like her personal bank, as if it was their responsibility to clean up her life. She refused to look for a job, refused to take responsibility, refused to admit that she had done this to herself. My parents, once willing to sacrifice anything for her, were now at their breaking point. Then came the final blow. One morning, I overheard my mom on the phone. The words were muffled at first, just sharp whispers of frustration. But when I stepped closer, I caught the most important part. My parents were on the verge of losing the house. The financial strain Rachel had put on them wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. The legal fees, the vacation costs, the fines, the endless money they had thrown at trying to protect Rachel from consequences had drained them dry. They had gone from being comfortable to struggling to pay the mortgage. They had ruined themselves for her, and now there was nothing left to give. Rachel overheard too, and instead of realizing what she had done, instead of offering to help, she exploded. She accused my parents of being selfish, of abandoning her, of failing as parents. She called them pathetic for struggling with money. She blamed them for everything, twisting reality until she was the victim once again. But this time, my parents didn't take it. This time, they fought back. My mom, who had spent years defending Rachel, finally snapped. She screamed at her, told her that she had ruined everything, that they had given her everything, and she had thrown it all away. My dad, the quiet enabler, didn't even try to soften the blow. He just sat there, jaw clenched, nodding along, letting Rachel finally feel the weight of what she had done. And then, the words that changed everything. They told Rachel she had 1 month to move out. At first, she didn't believe them. She laughed, scoffed, acted like it was just another fight, just another moment of frustration that would pass. But my mom wasn't bluffing. My dad wasn't arguing. They were serious. They told Rachel that if she wanted to keep acting like nothing was her fault, if she wanted to keep spending money they didn't have, if she wanted to pretend she was still the perfect daughter they would sacrifice everything for, then she could do it somewhere else. Rachel begged, but it didn't work. She promised to change, promised to do better, but my parents had finally learned their lesson. They told her that they were done fixing her mistakes, that they were done sacrificing for someone who had never cared about anyone but herself, that if she wanted to keep pretending she was untouchable, she could do it without their support. And Rachel, the golden child, the favorite, the chosen one, was finally being pushed out. 1 month later, Rachel packed her things. She didn't say goodbye. She barely even spoke. She left the house the same way she had always lived in it, like she was entitled to more, like she deserved better, like my parents had failed her, instead of the other way around. I didn't know where she went. I didn't ask. All I knew was that, for the first time in my life, my parents had chosen to let her go. And suddenly, everything was different. The house felt lighter. The tension was gone. My parents, who had spent my entire life ignoring me, suddenly started talking to me more. They started asking about my day, about my job, about my life. It was awkward at first, like they didn't know how to undo years of neglect, like they were realizing, too late, just how much damage they had done. I didn't forgive them right away. I didn't pretend that everything was fine, but I let them try. Rachel was gone. My parents had finally seen her for who she was. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible anymore. I thought that was the end of it. But then, A few months later, I got a text. Rachel. It was short. No greeting, no pleasantries, just one desperate sentence. She wanted to come home. She had nowhere else to go. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without a second thought, I deleted the message. Rachel had made her choices, and I wasn't going to be her next victim.